What if I told you that almost everything you thought you knew about Norse gods might have been wrong, and the real king of the gods wasn't Odin at all? It's no longer a what if, but there's growing evidence that it was something real. In a time before Odin lost his eye, and Thor was given his hammer, there was a different god, an all-powerful sky god who ruled over all domains. Because buried beneath the stories we think we know, there are older ones. Stories that whisper the name of the god time tried to forget. Welcome to the mysteries of mythology. Tyr. Welcome back, mystics. You might have heard his name in passing. Maybe you know him as a war god, or the one who lost his hand to the monstrous wolf Fenrir. Or maybe you recognize him from the God of War Ragnarok game, and if you're a metalhead, from the Black Sabbath song. He was a noble figure, but not the star of the show, not like Odin, with his ravens, his thrones, and his endless appetite for wisdom. In the book, The Norse Myths, A Guide to Gods and Heroes by Carolyne Larrington, you find Tyr in the less important Aesir chapter, which speaks to how we perceive him today. But what if Tyr wasn't always a side character? What if, long before Odin claimed the title of Allfather, before Thor lifted Mjolnir, there was only one god at the center of everything? A god of justice, a god of sacrifice, a god whose very name meant God. Tyr might not be the king of the Norse pantheon today, but there are a few scattered signs that he once was. And if that's true, we have to ask, why was he replaced? One of Tyr's most famous stories comes from the Prose Edda and centers on the monstrous wolf Fenrir. Fenrir was one of Loki's 3 strange and fearsome children, along with the Midgard serpent Jörmungandr and the death goddess Hel. Odin, always cautious, knew all 3 were fated to play a part in Ragnarok, the end of the world. Still, the gods raised Fenrir in Asgard, hoping they could keep him close and maybe even control him. But the wolf grew, fast, far too fast. Some even say he began devouring the gods' food stores, eating them out of house and home. The gods challenged Fenrir to let them bind him in chains and see if he could break free. And for the first 2 attempts, he did. Proud, arrogant, impossible to hold. So the gods turned to the dwarves of Svartalheim, the greatest craftsmen in all the realms. They forged a ribbon from 6 things, some that no longer exist. The sound of a cat's footfall, a woman's beard, mountain roots, a fish's breath, a bear's sinews, and bird's spittle. It was called Gleipnir, thin as silk, but impossible to break. Fenrir agreed to be bound, but only if one of the gods placed their hand in his mouth as a sign of trust. The gods hesitated. They knew what this meant. Tyr didn't. He stepped forward. No tricks, no negotiations, no looking to the others. He held out his hand, his right hand, the oath-giving hand. And when Fenrir realized he'd been betrayed and couldn't break free, he bit down, and Tyr lost his hand. That's the story he's most known for. No lightning, no shape-shifting, no clever escape. Just one god doing the right thing. Afterwards, the gods imprisoned Fenrir in a cave. They jammed the sword between his jaws, the hilt against his lower teeth, the blade piercing into the roof of his mouth. From his open jaws, saliva flowed and became the river Vorn, one of the mighty rivers of the otherworld. And there he waits, bound and gagged until the end of time. But Tyr's story doesn't end there. In the poem Lokasenna, the trickster Loki crashes a feast in Asgard, and, drunk and spiteful, he insults every god at the table. When it's Njord's turn, Loki jeers that the daughters of Humir, a giant we'll hear about, had used Njord's mouth as a urinal, that he tasted plenty of their urine. Loki also mocks Njord for having 2 children, Freyr and Freya, with his own sister. That's when Tyr jumps in to defend Freyr. He says Freyr is one of the best gods in all the halls of Asgard, that he never makes girls cry, never causes trouble for women, and always frees captives from their chains. and those qualities tell us exactly what Tyr valued most. Loki, of course, doesn't take this well. He tells Tyr to stay quiet, that he's terrible at settling disputes between men, and reminds him that it was Loki's own son, Fenrir, who bit off Tyr's right hand. But Tyr hits back with a sharp reply of his own. I lost that hand, and you lost that son. We've both suffered losses, and your son isn't doing well either. He's forever chained up, waiting for Ragnarok. Loki, never one to let someone else have the last word, throws one final insult at Tyr. Don't you know your own wife had a son by me, you poor fool, and I'll never pay you a penny in compensation for that. Let's talk about names. I've spoken about names in an earlier video, because in ancient belief systems, names weren't just labels. They carried weight, identity, meaning, power. And Tyr's name, according to Hermann Reichert, a doctor of language evolution who specializes in Germanic studies, it literally means God. Not in the way we say God of thunder or God of love. I mean his actual name, Tyr, comes from the Proto-Germanic Tiwas, which meant God, a divine being or skyfather. In Old English, he was Tyr, and that's where we get Tuesday or Tuesdag. And it doesn't stop there. If you go even further back, deep into the shared roots of Indo-European languages, you find Daos, one of the oldest sky gods. He's the ancestor of Zeus in Greece, Jupiter in Rome, and Daos Pitar in Vedic India. All sky gods, all rulers, all father figures. And Tyr, or Tiwaz, was their northern cousin. He was the god they carried when they carved runes for victory. And his presence wasn't just carved in runes, it was written into the land. There's Tiveden in Sweden, literally Tyr's forest, in Tissa in Denmark, Tyr's lake, and old places like Tisnes and Tislund, all signs that people didn't just speak his name, they lived it. In the poem Sigrid Drifrumal, a Valkyrie named Sigrid Drifa teaches the hero Sigurd how to prepare the sword for battle. She says, "You must know victory runes if you want to know victory. Carve them into your sword's hilt, on the blade guards and the blade, invoking Tyr's name twice." Unfortunately, there isn't much more written about Tyr as there is about gods like Freya, Odin and Thor. That being said, what we do have paints him as a fearless warrior who supports Midgard and its people. In the Prose Edda, in the chapter Gylfaginning, King Haur, who is really Odin in disguise, describes Tyr as daring and stout-hearted. He says Tyr always sways victory in war and that the warriors should call him before battle. We're even told that a brave person who never yields is Tyr strong, and someone wise is Tyr wise. So how does a god like that, one whose very name means God, end up as a supporting character in someone else's story? How do you go from being a skyfather to a one-handed war consultant with barely a handful of surviving myths? Clearly, something changed. Tyr's origins are blurry. In some stories, like those summarised in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, he's Odin's son. In other sources, such as the old poem Himiskavida from the Poetic Edda, his father is a Jotun, one of the beings who often oppose the Aesir gods, named Humir, and his mother was a woman described as gold-decked and shining brows, possibly one of the Alsinjur, the goddesses of the Aesir. And his grandmother, she's described as having 900 heads, classic Norse storytelling. But these contradictions tell us something important. No one seems to agree where he came from, almost like the myth makers were trying to rewrite him, just enough to squeeze him into someone else's story. And there's one myth where some think this might have happened. In the poem The Himiskavida, Tyr travels with Thor to the hall of his father, the Jotun Humir, to get a massive brewing cauldron, the best in the world. Why? Because the gods were planning a feast. Not just any feast, one hosted by Aegir, the sea giant. Aegir agreed to host it, but only if they could bring a cauldron big enough to brew ale for all of the gods, the biggest one in existence. In ancient Scandinavia, these kinds of feasts actually happened. Kings and chieftains would show up at the halls of their lords and demand to be hosted, to check who was loyal, who was skimming from the taxes, and who might be planning a rebellion. It starts as Tyr's story. He's the one who knows where the cauldron is, he knows the way, and it's his family who owns the cauldron. But halfway through, something shifts. Thor shows up and suddenly it's his story. At Hymir's hall, he eats 2 of the giant oxen, including one meant for Tyr. Hymir's furious and tells Thor he needs to catch more fish to make up for it. So Thor kills one of Hymir's best oxen, uses its head as bait, and rows them out to sea. There he catches 2 whales, and then hooks Jormungandr, the world serpent. He hauls it almost to the surface before Hymir, worried he could trigger the end of the world, panics and cuts the line. And when it's time to carry the cauldron back, Thor lifts it without breaking a sweat. Tyr tries to help but fails. And then Tyr disappears from the rest of the story. Some scholars like John Lindow and Margaret Clunies Ross think that's because he wasn't meant to be there in the first place. In older versions, it may have been Loki who made the journey with Thor. That would make sense. Loki is Thor's usual companion in myths like this. Clever, unpredictable, helpful when he wants to be. But as Loki's image grew darker, more chaotic, the myths may have needed someone else to step in, but not untrustworthy. And so they gave the role to Tyr. Tyr is old, older than Odin, older than Thor, maybe older than the word Aesir itself. Some sources even call him the Prince of Temples, a title that suggests sacred leadership, not just battle skill. He was also known by the title Thingsus, God of the Thing, the great assembly where disputes were judged and laws upheld. The title hints at a divine figure who didn't just swing a sword, but held authority in matters of justice and governance, the chieftain god in both war and council. There's a theory, and it's just a theory, but gaining ground, that Tyr was once the chief god, the original skyfather of the Germanic peoples. The evidence is scattered but compelling. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote about the gods of Germanic tribes. When he tried to match Norse gods with Roman equivalents, the god of war he saw wasn't like Mercury, the god he linked to Odin. He saw someone more like Mars. Most scholars agree he meant Tyr. And then there are the runestones. Some of the oldest ones found in Scandinavia mention Tyr, not Odin, when asking for victory or protection. Warriors carved it into their weapons, priests used it in charms. In some places the rune was even stacked again and again like a chant or a prayer. But over time, those domains, law, sacrifice, the runes themselves began to drift. Odin, once a shadowy figure, gained the runes by hanging himself on the world tree. He took the knowledge, magic, and kingship. He absorbed the spotlight, and slowly the myths followed him. Tyr gave without gain. In the story of Fenrir, he knew exactly what would happen. He saw the cost and stepped forward anyway. No tricks, no hidden plan, just a promise. And let's be honest, that kind of sacrifice, it feels rare these days. We live in a world that rewards the clever, the ones who calculate risk and weigh the outcomes before making a move. But Tyr didn't calculate, he committed. And that puts him in direct contrast with Odin. Odin sacrifices too, sure, but it's always for something. Wisdom, power, control. Tyr gave without expecting anything back. He didn't rewrite fate. He didn't escape the consequences. He simply held the line. Even his rune, the Tiwaz, was more than a symbol of war. In some old traditions, it was linked to the North Star, the one fixed point in the sky that never moves, never wavers. A guide for travellers, a compass for the lost. Just like Tyr himself, unwavering, constant, a way to stay true when everything else shifts. And you see echoes of Tyr in other traditions too. In Irish mythology, Nuada, the first king of the Tuatha De Danann, also lost his arm in battle, and because of that he gave up his throne. His nobility cost him power. Just like Tyr, he gave something up, not to win, but to do what was right. And that raises the question, What happens to people who do the right thing, even when it costs them? The ones who keep their word, even when no one's watching. The ones who know there's no prize waiting, but do it anyway. Let's be real, these people rarely end up in charge, but they matter. Tyr reminds us that honour isn't about winning. It's about standing up when it counts, even if no one notices, even if it hurts. And maybe that's why we need this story now more than ever. Because the world doesn't just need leaders who scheme, it needs people who are honourable and stay true.